I'm sure it was a thing. Not even grew I did forget. Which leads me to assume that because you know Latin, it would be the accusative of like duration. So it's like through the duration of the hot coffee. The English.
It belongs to me. It belongs to me.
We'll see.
Samuel, where should the handouts go?
Oh, that's a microphone.
Oh, that's a microphone. That's some kind of a wind control. It's meant to look friendly and not intimidating. I assume.
Got a quote sheet for you, Dr. Brewer.
Oh.
Thank you.
Well, Lathan has been pursuing a question that's at the heart of our integrated curriculum, and rightly so, I hazard, because it's at the heart of our intellectual inheritance. Why poetry? What is it for? What even is it? We love it. We learn so much from internalizing it in our memory and meditating on it in papers and class conversations, and we sing it out before seminars too loudly. But our favorite philosophers, Aristotle, Aquinas, Plato, our go-to guys for what for and what is it questions, they don't really give us the rich, fundamental, and satisfying answers for which we've come to adore them. Lathan is to be commended for asking these questions thoughtfully and earnestly. And perhaps it's worth noting that in doing so, and in turning for help to Jacques Maritain, 20th century Catholic philosopher, friend and helper of so many artists and poets. In doing so, he joins a long line of WCC senior thesists. You are in good company, and for good reasons.
All right. Well, first of all, I'd just like to thank my panelists. I'd like to first of all thank you, Dr. Cooper, for being my advisor. Even though, especially this semester, you were very busy, just your inspiration, especially last semester with my thesis, was the driving force. And I'll never forget you first reciting God's grandeur to us freshman year when we were studying the Iliad. So, thank you. And then, Dr. Virginia, thank you for stepping up and adopting me, as it were, when Dr. Cooper couldn't make it, and becoming my kind of second advisor for my eration. So thank you so much for that and for your inspiration. And then Dr. Grove, thank you for being my third panelist, and for cracking such great jokes in music class. It was a good time. So thank you for that. And then let's go ahead and just begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who fled to thy protection, implored thy help, sought thine intercession, was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, I fly unto thee, O Virgin of Virgins, my Mother. To thee do I come, before thee I stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not my petitions, but in thy mercy hear and answer me. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Have you ever ridden on a subway train? It's not what I would call a particularly pleasant experience. They're underground, fluorescent light only. They're typically pretty filthy. You might be looking around, see some half scratched off stickers splotched on the walls randomly, a pile of what could have been McDonald's before it was stepped on. And you're usually standing far too close together so that if you do bump into someone, you try to look back at your toes as fast as possible. Maybe you even have your earbuds in and are listening to the latest Taylor Swift album with a glazed expression on your face. Ezra Pound, an American poet, had a similar experience in a subway or metro train during a visit of his to France. And yet, when Pound stepped out of the metro train into the station, he had an experience very different from any other time that he had ever done the same thing. In his memoir, Pound recounts this, saying that 3 years ago in Paris, I got out of a metro train at La Concorde and saw suddenly a beautiful face, and then another, and another, and then a beautiful child's face, and then another beautiful woman. And I tried all that day to find words for what this had meant to me, and I could not find words that seemed to me worthy or as lovely as that sudden emotion. Pound, in his return home, tried to express this emotion. He tried writing descriptions. He wrote many, many poems. And after a long process, he finally hit upon the poem that he wrote. It was just 2 simple lines, much shorter than his previous attempts. And it is entitled In a Station of the Metro. And I'd like to read it for you. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. What springs to your mind when you hear these 2 simple lines? In my experience, I learned many different things through many different attributes or parts of the poem. For instance, if I look to Pound's word choice, Pound could have said the sight of these faces in the crowd, and yet he chose a word apparition that usually designates an appearance of something divine in the world. He could have talked about those faces or the faces, but he specifically wanted to say these faces in the crowd. That's saying something. Or in just the sound of the poem. When I read, for instance, the first line of the poem, I can hear, as it were, the beat of the train throughout his repetition of the articles the, these, and the apparition of these faces in the crowd. And then suddenly in the second line, that image is suddenly shattered, but not in a loud or sudden way, but with the soft word, petals, which then continues for the rest of the second line. A word that is not only soft in its sound, but soft in its meaning. That connotates a kind of delicacy. And all of these parts of this poem, the sound, the language, the rhythm, come together and create an image that I hope you experienced when I first read this poem. Create an expression of something, an expression of that sudden emotion. Continuing in his memoir, Pound writes that in a poem of this sort, one is trying to record the precise instant when a thing outward and objective transforms itself or darts into a thing inward and subjective. In other words, Pound saw an outward and an objective thing, the faces of the people in the crowd outside of the metro. And yet that experience darted into him and gave him the sudden emotion that he's expressing in his poem. It transformed him. In other words, poetry is not something one-sided. It's an encounter between two beings, between the thing, the objective thing, and the subjective poet. Jacques Maritain defines poetry in his book, Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry, in terms of this encounter or communication. He writes that he would call poetry that intercommunication between the inner being of things and the inner being of the hidden self, which is a kind of divination. Now, there are 2 important parts of this definition that I want to call our attention to. The first is that it is an intercommunication between things and the self, or between the poet and reality. Like we just mentioned with Pound's poem, it's an encounter. Another word that Maritain uses in his book is an interpenetration. It's a coming together that is not simply one-sided, but it's something wherein the poet discovers something about himself and about reality through its entrance into him. The second thing I want to call our minds to is the second part of the definition, wherein he says it's a kind of divination. Well, what does he mean by a divination? Well, he's talking about a divination of the spiritual and the things of sense. And when Maritain talks here about spiritual, what he means is what we might call immaterial or transcendental. He later associates this word with the object of the science of metaphysics, being itself, right? Transcendental, immaterial reality. That's what he means by spiritual. So in short, Maritain is claiming that poetry has as its object the same kind of thing as metaphysics, being itself, the spiritual. In this oration, I want to dive into this definition and examine it and use it to present a defense of poetry through our continued understanding of the nature of poetic knowledge. And I'm going to do that by looking at those 2 distinct parts of that definition and diving into each part and what that tells us about the nature of poetry. But first, you might be wondering why I use the word defense. It doesn't seem like poetry is under any sort of attack, except it is. And it started with our good friends, Bacon and Descartes. Everything else. Bacon and Descartes laid the seeds of the Enlightenment before it came along but this was continued in the writings of Enlightenment philosophers and then into people like Thomas Hobbes, the great political philosopher. And they sowed the seeds of scientism, of a world where science took the priority, and where poetic or figurative knowledge or speech fell by the wayside. Hobbes actually describes this in his Leviathan, writing that, and on the contrary, metaphors and senseless and ambiguous words are like ignes fatui, a fool's fire, and reasoning upon them is wandering amidst innumerable absurdities, and their end contention and sedition or contempt. What Hobbes is writing here is an idea concurrent with many philosophers following from the Enlightenment scientistic tradition, where it is obvious, like figurative language by its very nature is the kind of thing that has a multiplicity of meanings and associations. But in a world where science is key, where science is at the top of the hierarchy, figurative language has no place because precision is key in science. We don't want to have this multiplicity of meanings and associations. We want to be precise so that we know exactly what we're talking about. But in this oration, I would like to argue that science is a useful thing, but that we need to push back against this Enlightenment thought, and that poetry is also a valid form of coming to know, of knowledge, and of thinking intellectually. And as we'll see later on in this oration, it's precisely in this idea of a multiplicity of meanings and associations that we find this answer. But I'd like to start at the very beginning. So when we think about knowing or reasoning, there are two kinds we can turn to. Reasoning is either discursive or intuitive. Now, discursive thinking is what we usually think of as reasoning, as thinking with our intellect. It's logical. It's when we present a syllogism, we're thinking discursively. And yet, we also have intuitive thinking. And I think a good example to go to is in mathematics. In mathematics, we present proofs. We use equations to think logically or discursively in order to get from one point to another. Except that first point always has to come from somewhere. And that is the role of intuitive knowledge, where all of the axioms, all of the ideas, the preconceptual ideas that we take in mathematics and then further follow from are all something we come to know intuitively. It's not that we have a lesser kind of knowledge about them, but it is a different kind of knowledge, and perhaps not as high in the realm of the intellect. Maritain then associates this idea of intuitive knowing with poetry. He writes, but when it comes to poetry, the part of intuitive reason becomes absolutely predominant. Then, as our further analyses will show, we are confronted with an intuition of emotive origin, and we enter the nocturnal empire of a primeval activity of the intellect, which, far beyond concepts and logic, exercises itself in vital connection with imagination and emotion. We have quit logical reasoning and even conceptual reason, yet we have to do more than ever with intuitive reasoning, functioning in a non-rational way. Science resides in the part of the intellect that is conscious, it's conceptual. Science deals in logical thought. Science is discursive. Whereas when it comes to poetry, poetry deals in the intuitive part of the soul. And I don't want to get into Maritain's whole argument here because it's very complicated and pretty lengthy. But if we go back to the traditional Aristotelian argument for the soul is divided into parts, right? It's the intellect, the imagination, and then the senses. In discursive reasoning, we're operating purely in the intellect, in the conscious conceptual part of our soul. Maritain argues, though, that there is a subconscious part of our soul wherein the intellect comes together with the imagination and the senses, and it is here that poetry resides. Maritain argues that poetry is the fruit neither of the intellect alone nor of imagination alone. Nay, more, it proceeds from the totality of man, sense, imagination, love, desire, instinct, blood, and spirit together. That poetry comes from a place in our soul which exercises itself in a more total fashion, where our soul is structured of intellect, of imagination, and of senses. And yet when it comes to discursive logical reasoning, we kind of operate in an abstraction from those senses and from the imagination. Maritain is arguing that with poetry instead, we're operating, while in a more subconscious way, in a much more total way, in a much more integrated way with our entire soul. Now, this argument has two large implications. The first is that poetry is an act of the entire human person, or the entire human soul. While the intellect, in a way, is abandoning or moving away from the senses, poetry integrates our entire soul in the pursuit of knowledge, which we'll talk more about later. But there's also a second implication of this statement, which is that poetry, because it comes from this subconscious part of the soul and is more integrated with the senses, it can approach universal or transcendental knowledge in a much different way than metaphysics. Maritain argues that metaphysics pursues essences and definitions, poetry every form glittering by the way, every reflection of an invisible order. The one isolates the mystery in order to know it, the other, through the harmonies it constructs, handles and makes use of mystery like an unknown force. In other words, metaphysics abstracts in order to realize universals, right? We can study the abstraction or generality of man, and yet we've moved very far away from the senses at that point, or of imagination. Man is a generality that we can apply to all men, and yet we've lost much information about man in that process since it's been abstracted so far. Maritain continues that precisely because it has no conceptualized object, it, poetic intuition, tends and extends to the infinite. It tends towards all the reality, the infinite reality which is engaged in any singular existing thing. I think a good poem to start us thinking and understanding this important idea is Hopkins' As Kingfishers Catch Fire. I just want to read the first part of that poem. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. As tumbled over rim and roundy well stones ring, like each tuck string tells, each hung bells, bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being endures, each one dwells, selves, goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. In other words, each particular concrete individual speaks out its being through its individuality. For instance, I speak out the nature of humanity, of human nature, in a very different way than Jacob Baska does. And yet, by our own particular individuality, we do it in our own way, and we're able to do it in a full way. As Maritain says, it tends towards all the reality, in a way that if I just say man, Jacob Baska and I both fit into that definition, but there's also a lot different about us and a lot that you lose in just saying we're both men versus looking at each of our concrete particulars. And this is where I want to get to the idea of an idea versus an image. I think this is a really important clarification here, that an idea is something, or a concept is something that we deal with in science, whereas an image is the corresponding object that we deal with in poetry. And I think John Crowe Ransom, great literary critic, defines this really well. He says that an idea is derivative and tamed. The image is in a natural or wild state, and it has to be discovered there, not put there, obeying its own law and none of ours. We think we can lay hold of image and take it captive, but the docile captive is not the real image, but only the idea, which is the image with its character beaten out of it. Mm-hmm. If we return to Pound's poem, he did not just have an idea, right? We could talk about many conceptual ideas related to the poem. We could talk about the fact of individuality in a modern society. We could talk about the difference between technology and a more rural culture, right? There are many different ideas that we can try to fit into the poem. But that's very different from the original image, which was pregnant with meanings, right? Pound saw something, and then that came into him and was informed with his own subjective self, his own associations, his own experiences, and it was a full image that contained much reality, not a little abstracted piece of it. I want to use an example, And the example I want to use is that of water. Speaking of water, in his book, Understanding Poetry, Leon Brooks uses this example as a great example of this idea of an idea in an image. He writes, the formula, H2O, differs tremendously from even the common word water. For the word water, neutral as it seems in connotation, still may possess all sorts of different associations. Drinking, bathing, boating, the pull of the moon to create tides, the liquid form which the goddess Aphrodite rose, or, as Keats puts it, the moving waters at their priest-like task of pure ablution round earth's human shores. What Brooks is stating here is the fact that those many associations, the multiplicity of associations and meanings that Hobbes talked about, are implicitly already in human language by its nature. Human beings are naturally figurative creatures because we are spiritual beings that also have, we also have bodies, right? We're hylomorphic beings. And so by our nature, we're the kind of things that need to abstract from our senses. We need to gain all of our knowledge and things from the senses in order to then think about them in a more abstract way. Both Aristotle and Thomas talk about the fact that in a human being, all knowledge originally comes from the senses, and then it can be abstracted, etc. But the problem with abstraction in human beings is that is the fact that we are limited to the world of sense, right? Like when we abstract, we use our intellect in a pure way, which is a high form of knowing. But we cannot know as the angels do. For instance, the angels can apprehend essences directly. Like an angel can apprehend some transcendental or universal without having to understanding it from the ground up, as it were. But we humans don't have that luxury. And so whenever we abstract, we remove ourselves further and further from our original information, so that in the furthest sciences, in the highest sciences, we are most further abstracted or removed from reality. And it is thus the hardest to think and talk about them, as we seniors have experienced in metaphysics this semester so far. It's because it is so far abstracted from the original material that we know that it gets harder and harder to talk about it. In a very different way, poetry aims to learn about those same transcendentals, those same spiritual essences of being through the very finite particulars, through the things we're sensing, rather than through some abstraction from them. In his lectures on Shakespeare, Coleridge, I think, puts this really well. Just speaking of exactly what happens when you read Shakespeare, for instance, out of all the poets. But this, I think, is a good explanation of just what happens when we read a great poet. He writes, "Here is a union of thoughts, a bringing all into one. You see not only the sun rising over the mountains, but you have also the moral feeling with which the rapidity of the poet's mind has connected it. You behold the sun sovereign of the world, the elation of the high mountain flattered by a glance of his beams, and the activity of the poet's mind, which in one image has merged so many associations. You feel him to be a poet inasmuch as, for a time, he has made you one, an active, creative being." That in reading poetry, all of these associations and this multiplicity of meanings present in figurative language come together and allow us to enact our being, our fundamentally creative being. This goes back to when Maritain says that the preconscious life of the soul, that interior, intuitive part of the soul and the intellect, is fundamentally creative in its being. That human beings are meant to be creative, both in our image, in likeness after our creator, but also in the fact that we have been given the things of sense in order to gain more knowledge from them. That it is fundamentally creative in order for us to, it is a fundamentally creative thing that we are able to take these things of sense and learn from them in a poetic way. That we have been given a gift, I think, to be able to pursue the universal or pursue the infinite through the finite. And it is something that is foundational, that is already found in human nature. Again, in his book, Understanding Poetry, Clarence Brooks points out that by the very nature of the human being, the ordinary citizen in the ordinary day speaks much of what we might call incipient poetry. He attempts to communicate attitudes, feelings, and interpretations, including ideas. It is part of human nature that we communicate in this figurative or poetic way, simply because in doing so, we operate not as some angelic being who apprehends only with their intellect, but we utilize all parts of the soul and the fact that we have been given a body and senses as well as an intellect. Remember that poetry is not a rejection of the intellect. It is a coming together, an integral working of the intellect with the imagination and with the senses. All right. I'm not saying necessarily in this oration that we should reject science. I love science. Math is like my favorite subject. But I think it's really important in light of Enlightenment thinking, in light of what Hobbes is saying, all of these philosophers who are deeply influential on our culture and on this modern scientific age, that we realize the nature of a poetic disposition, of poetic knowledge, so that we're not tempted to become Gnostic and reject the world underneath us. We are fundamentally made to be creative beings and fundamentally made to use the world that we are a part of. In fact, I think a beautiful expression of this is the fact that in his Confessions, St. Augustine talks about the truth that, or well, I guess speculation, because none of us know what the second life will be like, that even in the beatific vision, when we are beholding God with our intellect in his entirety, we will still be using our eyes and our other senses to behold him through the second created world around us. And God doesn't want us to reject these lower parts of us. He wants us to embrace them and use them in accordance and integration with the higher parts of us or our intellect. And that's exactly what the poetic mode does. So in conclusion, it's just important to remember that poetry is a fundamentally creative act, and we are fundamentally creative beings. And that if we reject poetry, then we risk becoming what the great writer Alan Tate called angelic in our imagination. That we're rejecting our human nature. We're rejecting the place we've been given. So once more, I would like to just return to the poem we started with, Pound's poem, and to read it one more time and think about what we've learned about the nature of poetry and see if we can glean some truth, glean some of that transcendental infinity through these simple words. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Thank you.
Let's begin with questions from our panel. Dr. Groh, would you like to begin?
Sure. Yeah, thank you very much, Lathan, for an oration and I presume a thesis preceding it that touch on, more than touch on, delve into, as you suggested, or as your advisor suggested, something that just makes this college, right? At times polarizing, we should see it rather as unifying the entirety of the college, faculty and student body alike, bringing the poetic and the philosophic together. I was thinking towards the end there of your remarks of how in my own lifetime, and I think yours, maybe not quite yours, two popes have led the way, and John Paul II saying that without a return to philosophy, we're doomed, and Benedict XVI saying without a return to art and beauty, we're doomed. Basically, rather than see those as contradictory, we want to see them as complementary. Yeah. Let me start by asking you, and this isn't necessarily the question that would be best ask first, but it's the one that I'm thinking of first. Is poetry communicable? We had a wonderful oration yesterday from Mr. Brown on the incommunicability of the person. Poetry, as Martin says, engages the totality of man. It's a deeply personal encounter. I hesitate to even say truth for other reasons, but is the experience that we have in poetry communicable, or is there some radical incommunicability there?
I think a distinction needs to be made where we need to know exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about what exactly is being communicated. Because on the one hand, because poetry is that coming together of the objective outward thing, the things, and the inward subjective self, right? Because the self is such a big part of that, a person's poetic experience or poetic vision, to some extent, is not communicable. Like for instance, when Shakespeare wrote what he wrote, for instance, if he was describing a sunset, I can try to glean some of the truths, like some of his vision from his statement, but unless I have all of the associations or past experiences that he does, I'm not going to get everything. So in that sense, it's not entirely communicable. But I think that the important thing is that in many ways it is, because we share so many experiences and associations and meanings of words. And it is exactly through those that a poet, like the whole work of poetry, when one is writing poetry, is to try to make it as communicable as possible. So you're trying to take your vision that is colored with your own subjectivity and make it communicable or available to others through your words. So I would say to that extent, it is like I think my answer to the question as a whole would be yes, it is communicable. But I just qualify that with, to a certain extent, you can't communicate everything about your own subjectivity.
And then my next brick is this. What does the scientific or the philosophical lack? Clearly it lacks. What does it lack and why?
Yeah, I think a simple answer is it lacks meaning. So for instance, if I'm trying to understand man or human nature, one way I can do it is through science, which is through abstraction or through conception. And so I try to formulate an idea that will encompass all of man. And to do so, I have to sort of pare down all the details until I'm left with a generality. And so in that sense, I have gained something. I have gained a real kind of universal, a generality, but I've also lost a lot of truth where just because I need to fit all men inside of that definition. So in that sense, I'd say that that's the most part what a scientific idea or concept is lacking. Like Ransom said, it just has lost a lot of its meaning because most of the meaning is to be held in the very particularity of the thing. So I think that while there are definitely places for scientific generalities, and for instance, there are things we couldn't talk about without scientific abstractions or generalities, that in many ways it is lacking because it just so much is lost through that abstraction further and further from the senses.
And what is gained then
In poetry,
in the philosophical mode?
in the philosophical mode, by abstraction.
Yeah.
I think that what is gained is the fact that there are some things, for instance, that we just are not really able to think about. And I think also what I was talking about, precision, is true. Like for instance, when we're operating in a certain science, like in a mathematical science, then we want technical mathematical terms and concepts. Or when we're operating in chemistry or physics, then we need precise technical terms in order to think about that. If we try to do, for instance, like physics in a poetic way, it would become quite a bit of a mess pretty quickly. I can understand some truths about the world in a poetic way, but then it's hard to continue with that discursive form of logic in order to find more things out if I don't have those precise terms and definitions. So I think in that way, science and abstraction, conceptual ideas are very useful because we can hold them in our head in a way that we can't with with a poetic image, just because it's too large for our intellect alone.
We'll turn it over to Dr. Virginia.
Toy Story? To Infinity and Beyond. Buzz Lightyear? Okay,
Hey, it's a good movie. It's a good movie.
Julia saw that when she was a little girl, and she got on a booster chair, one of those things that toddlers use, and we had a 12-foot drop from the middle part of this old house in New Hampshire to the first landing below, and she got up on there and she went to infinity and beyond and fell 12 feet down. And yeah, but the reason I bring up that image, which is so vivid in my mind still, is that doesn't seem to be really what you talked about, to infinity. Because you talked about the profoundly human. If I think of to infinity and beyond, I think of philosophy, and this is not a coherent question, just by the way. I think that philosophy needs to be defended by poetry rather than poetry by philosophy. If that makes any sense. Why are we always defending poetry around here philosophically?
Because
If
of the
we don't-
incommunicability of poetry.
Well,
I told you I was laying bricks. I can put up a whole building. I'm just
Yeah,
restraining
the whole tendency is at WCC is, why do I like poetry? Oh my gosh, something's happened to me. I love poetry. And I have to defend it because really philosophy is much more serious. And really gives us an account of things. Anyway, this always
Philosophers
bothers me.
are very serious about poetry.
But only to think about it. Well, here's my question. I don't really have a question because I love what you did. Can we be fully human without poetry? I mean, to say it is the first thing, before Plato, he has to use Homer. Can we live in the world without image transformed into language, which then reveals ourselves to us? My question comes out of that 1, 2, 3, 4th quote of Maritain on the inner being of the hidden self. And you suggested that Pound sees something about himself that he wouldn't have seen if he hadn't experienced those particular faces as apparitions in the crowd. Right. So what is it that poetry does that reveals ourselves to ourselves that perhaps philosophy can't do?
Yeah, totally. It's that I think a good way of putting this is, and this kind of goes back to that title as well. It was the title of my thesis, and which had focused more on the idea of reaching the infinite through the finite, that kind of poetic process down and up, as Father William Lynch would put it. But I think that right, the infinite is something that as spiritual beings we've kind of been presented with, that we are part of. Like we are spiritual beings, like we are intellectual beings, and yet we have been, as Maritain laments at one point, been kind of trapped in the things of sense. Like we want to know not just like material things, but we want to know causes. Like Aristotle says in the Metaphysics, we want to know like essences, transcendentals. We want to know those spiritual truths. And yet those aren't readily available to us just in philosophy to a certain extent, in ourselves, like truths about ourselves. But what happens in poetry is that it's this outward thing that is then communicated into us and then is informed with my subjectivity in a way, so that when I write poetry or when I kind of think about a poetic experience I've had, I'm not only learning about the thing, but I'm also learning about things about myself that I maybe didn't know, that it pulled out of me. Like for instance, when I read Pound's poem, I thought there are just all these connotations, ideas that I thought, for instance, of the fact that, like, scientifically speaking, the face is one of the most distinctive things about the human person. And yet it wasn't until he had this moment of sudden emotion that he sort of realized that, or realized that the people around him were beautiful and that he considered them so, or that he cared about the people around him, right? Like that's a truth about himself that he didn't see until he had this experience, this sudden emotion that he could have reasoned to, but you're not necessarily going to come to that same place of knowledge if just by pure reason. I think something John Sr. goes to this where he says that love, like Merrington says, both knowledge, creativity, and love come from this kind of preconscious life of the intellect. And John Sr. says that bound up in this poetic way of knowing, because it is connected to the emotion, are things like actually loving and knowing ourselves. That we can come to perhaps know ourselves in a philosophical way, but part of knowing is also like loving and responding to that. And you can't really do that in a purely philosophical sense, that you need the poetic in some sense to realize that on that emotive level to some extent.
Is poetry unsettling if it discovers to the person the hidden self within the person? It has this holistic way of bringing the world all together. Is it unsettling? Do you have to change your life?
You have to change your life. I mean, potentially. I guess it could definitely be unsettling. I don't think it necessarily has to be, but I could see like certain poems or a poetic experience, like being unsettling in a way that you might have to change some stuff.
I mean, I think it has that kind of power where the transformative power that all of you experience here has to do with the kind of profound prick in your self-understanding that otherwise you wouldn't, that you wouldn't experience in a philosophy class, it seems to me. I don't want to contend with my bigger colleague here.
Socrates was basically known as the big prick.
Did you say that?
You just used that word.
I didn't mean it that way.
I didn't either.
Who allowed us to appeal?
I don't know where she's going. The gadfly.
Did you want to question any of these answers?
Well, I'd like to throw one more idea out into the mix. It's fun sitting next to Virginia. I know we can get away with things. If you could just address one more point. The philosophical tradition assigns truth to the second act of the mind, to judgment. It's not found in the first act of the mind or understanding. How might that principle play into poetry, poetic intuition, connection with reality, whatever?
Well, I think in that sense, it's very similar. Just that right, we're still operating in the intellect. It's still operating in the same way. And Maritain talks a lot about the agent intellect, or he likes to call it the illuminating intellect, which, because our intellect is a spiritual thing, and we're working off of matters of sense or physical interactions, that agent intellect has to kind of abstract or make spiritual all sensations or apprehensions we have, so that we can actually think about them in our intellect. And in the same way as that happens in philosophy, right, that also happens in poetry to a certain extent. It's just that instead of it being pulled up purely, like fully into the intellect and being fully abstracted so that we can hold it in our mind as a concept or as an idea, like for instance, I can say like, all men walk or all men eat or something like that. Hold this concept in my mind. That in a poem, I can't do that in the same way. It hasn't been actualized or abstracted in the same way because it's this image, and it kind of stopped at one point along the train of abstraction, if you will. So I can't hold it in my mind the same way, but it is also actualized and made intelligible by the agent intellect. So I think in the same way that, like you said, truth only exists in the second act of the intellect, I feel like that's also true.
Would it be fair to say then that maybe poetry compensates for the lack of abstractive completeness by the multiplication of images?
I think so. And I think in some ways it not only compensates, but goes further than the abstraction, right? Like there's like I said, there's some instances where abstraction to a far degree is really important, but also there are instances where, for instance, if I'm really trying to know the nature of man, I think that reading a character like Hamlet in many ways gives me a better idea of the nature of man than just reading a lot of definitions about who man is. So in that sense, the
Does it
multiplicity.
give you the nature of man or the nature of Hamlet?
Well, I think the idea is that through the particular, it gives you ideas of the nature of man. Like, right, Hamlet
What is
is
he a particular of?
that he's a particular of the human race, right?
But how do you know that if you're only looking at Hamlet?
Well, I guess so. So right, the idea in poetry, right, is that is sort of counterintuitive. That somehow we're trying to get to a universal. And Aristotle treats this in his Poetics, trying to get to a universal through a particular, and that doesn't make sense initially. But then Aristotle and then Maritain and many others in the tradition clarify that what he means by universal there is not the same thing. So it's not a generality. And so in that way, you can't, like, Hamlet fits into a generality man. So in that way, we're not getting the exact same thing through poetry. What I mean by human nature is something more like the nature of things or the essence of things, but not in a general way, in a universal way, as in like all men are like this, but it doesn't lose any of all of the associations, the meanings, or the particular.
Yeah, it is, after all, creative intuition, not creative imagination. I was struck by this quote from Maritain. That's about the fifth one. Such divination of the spiritual and the things of sense, which also will express itself in the things of sense. It begins in sense and has to terminate in sense. You can't leave particularity aside altogether.
Exactly.
Though it is the intuitive act. It is the intellect and act. All right, I'm done. Thank you.
What is the menace that faces a person or a society that buys into the scorn of poetry that Hobbes, for instance, you mentioned angelism and you mentioned, but can you make it more concrete? I can't live in a world of abstractions. Make it poetically powerful.
I think first of all, it's just that society or that person is faced with a sort of contradictory existence where he has been placed in a position and given certain tools and gifts to operate according to his nature, which is, this hylomorphic being, body and soul. And in doing the Descartesian thing and doing the Cartesian thing, he's trying to reject the very spot he came from, or he's trying to intellectualize while trying to reject the very things that allowed him to do that in the first place. So first of all, it just seems to me contradictory to completely get rid of the poetic. You could see an example. You could see, for instance, like, I don't know, also if someone said like, okay, I'll reject like lyric poetry, but I'll still like sense things and maybe appreciate a sunset every once in a while or something like that, right? But what Maritain's talking about is not just like written lyrical poetry. He's talking about this disposition of soul that in which we have this deep communication with the created world. And I think that it's just been shown to us time and time again that this is the way that we're supposed to act and to reach our salvation as human beings. I talked about this more in my thesis, but I think Christ is a great example of how God could have saved us just by, saying something from heaven, or by, I don't know, just directly delivering to our minds like the essence of virtue or how to reach salvation or something like that. But instead, he took on human nature. He came down into the finite and into the material, and then died and operated in the finite in order to bring us to the infinite, in order to allow us to reach salvation, to reach spiritual end. And so I think that among many others, that's a great example of just the fact that like God likes using secondary causes, and to reject poetry or to reject this disposition of soul is to reject that and to live a contradictory life. I think it would be deeply unsettling and problematic.
Have we seen examples of that in history?
Of like societies, or I don't think entirely. I think a great example is the fact that almost every single one of these philosophers who tries to claim that we should get rid of metaphor, use metaphor. Like for instance, the Leviathan is a metaphor for the city. And that it's not something you can entirely get rid of because it's built so deeply into our human nature. So I don't think there's a great example of someone who is able to do this entirely, just because it's practically impossible that you would have to, I think, cease living as a human being in order to give up, I don't know, something inherent in your nature
I
like
suppose
that.
that suggests the possibility that if we don't develop our faculties for enjoying the rich associations of language and experience in such a way that we find ourselves anew in experience and in language, that someone else will control the metaphorical side of our being, like a Hobbes who's creating a Leviathan, feeding us the metaphors by which we live, and then the inner being of the self never emerges.
That, I mean, that, right, that's entirely possible, especially if, you, like you said, were to kind of almost look to other people's subjective selves instead of developing yours in a certain way, which is why I think that just the line from Coleridge was really beautiful, that like great poets are not just good enough to be able to show you their subjective experience of something, but to pull you into it and make you do it yourself, which I've experienced in
You
reading
can't
great
really
poets.
read a Shakespeare play without being dislocated into that kind of activity, just to utter those sentences. Thank you. Questions from the audience?
Jake.
First off, thank you very much for including me in your project.
Oh,
It's an
yeah.
honor. You mentioned that Layfield wasn't particularly talking about lyric poetry. Can I insert into everything you just presented Bach, Da Vinci, any sort of artistic experience in which I can see reality in a different light? Or are you, because all of your examples were about lyric poetry, everyone you've mentioned is really focusing in on lyric poetry. Did you mean for this to only argue for that, or can we think of it in a greater sense?
I wanted to focus on lyric poetry and my thesis and my oration, just because it's a huge project to try to extend it to other kinds of art as well. I actually, one of the projects that I want to do is to try to start applying this to music, which is potentially the hardest one, but maybe the most important. But in his earlier work, Art and Scholasticism, Lathan calls poetry, as he's talking about it, the life of each and all the arts. But in particular, he's talking about the fine arts. I think good ones to go to, if we're thinking about applying this to other things, are the mimetic arts, the ones that Aristotle talks about in the Poetics. So like music, for instance, is another big one, along with other forms of poetry like tragedies, comedies, epics, etc. I think the modern novel is another great example of one that works very well with this framework. It does become a little bit more complicated when you sort of move away from those arts. Like painting, for instance, is also an art that Maritain wants to say poetry is the life of in the same way. But just because it's a little bit different of a thing, it's a little bit harder to see. And so more thought would have to go into that. But in general, Maritain wants to say that like what he's talking about here is the disposition that should be at the heart of all the arts, but in particular the fine arts, the mimetic arts.
No one else. Taking off what you just said, it's interesting that there's some dispute about how many different arts Aristotle means to include under the umbrella of his discussion of fine arts, and I incline to be with those who say all the fine arts without exception. Certainly the word poesis meant what? Making.
Yeah.
Which is significant. It's not,
Mhm.
even though the muses are important, you have to be inspired from above to have this divination. But the essence, at least if we look at the word in Greek, it's not on what you see, what you are inspired by, but what you craft, what you make. You want to say something about that, maybe?
Yeah, I didn't get to talk about that as much as I wanted to, because I mostly wanted to focus on like the nature of poetic knowledge in this oration. But I think just the aspect of it being creative is really important. Like I think when Maryton talks about the fact that this preconscious life of the soul, where poetry comes from, this intuitive part of the soul, is where things like knowing, he says, like love, supersensuous desires, but also like creating, like the creative aspect comes from that part of the soul. And I think it's true that poetry is at its heart like creative. It's about making. But I do think it's important to realize what we mean by that. Because I remember thinking about this when I was first doing research, that, well, then does it mean that if you don't write poetry, you're losing everything, right? I don't think that's necessarily what Aristotle's talking about, that like you have to write poetry or you have to paint or you have to write music, right? That there is part of this that is a disposition, and you can act in a certain way and you're still being creative, right? Like the creative aspect is less, it is part of, right, the writing of poetry, the using of language, like you said, Dr. Virginia, in order to express that image, that experience. But it's also that communication wherein you take that thing and bring it into yourself. I think that's creative too at its heart, that you're creating that image that Ransom talks about, which is the combination of the thing and yourself, right? It's not either or the other. That's
Creating
something
an
that
image suggests both creative and mimetic.
Right.
Does this connect to the communicability question that Dr. Grove began with? That is, it's one thing to be kind of full of divinatory inklings from the world of sense and emotion and the things and persons around us. And it's another thing to make a thing that somehow houses or channels those intuitions and makes them enterable for others.
It might even be that anything that's made as opposed to simply received is by that token communicable, because it's made in terms of, it's made through our nature.
But if you can't resuscitate language like Hopkins does, or Pound, if you can't resuscitate language, if you can't surprise by dissonance and unpredictability that the poet uses, then you can't awaken anything.
That's what I was trying to do with the P word, and you didn't like it.
Well, why did you use the P word instead of the G word?
People have no self-control.
I don't know. I think
It's day 2 of 3 days.
I think the muses are just inspiring.
It's interesting, by the way, that Augustine, speaking more philosophically, says verum facere, even truth is made, which doesn't mean it's not connected with reality, but based on what we intuit of reality, then we fabricate in a positive sense.
Yeah. And I think one other thing that I just would like to say about that is just the fact that I think making and that kind of creating of the art is really important, because it is by its nature intuitive, that we can't hold, right, the image in our mind in the same way as a concept. So Maryton says, like, to give it that real life, like there's a way in which we've already done the poetic thing just by seeing that and letting it enter us. But really, to give it life, it's important to actually make, right, to write the music, to write the poetry, because otherwise there's no way that we can think about it, right? Like the only way you can share or hold the image or the poetic experience some way in your hands or in your head is through the poem or the piece of art, because it can hold more than just an idea. Or
So it makes it communicable to us.
Exactly. That's the way it becomes communicable to
So
others.
just as Zucker-Kandel says that all men are musical in one sense, but only some are musical in a fabricating sense. I think you could extend that and say we're all poets,
Mhm.
but we're not all
Mhm.
able to turn out poems.
Thank you very much, Lathan. Thank you all.